How America built the most powerful weapons arsenal in history. Where are you watching from today, city and country? Let us know in the comments. And before we begin, please subscribe, like, and share this video so this story can reach more people around the world, because some of the history we were told was polished, edited, and packaged to sound clean. But the truth is far more dangerous, far more complicated, and far more powerful than most people ever imagined. Because the story of how America built the most powerful weapons arsenal in history did not begin with one bomb, one war, or one president. It began with fear, with factories, with steel, with silence, and with a decision made behind closed doors that once the United States discovered what industrial power could do in war, it would never again allow itself to be weak. And to understand that moment, we have to go back to a time when the country that would later dominate the skies, the seas, the deserts, the mountains, the oceans, and even space was not yet the unstoppable giant the world now knows, because before America became a machine of permanent military readiness, it was still a nation, learning how quickly peace could die. And when the world exploded into the chaos of the Second World War, Washington saw something terrifying. Not just the rise of enemies abroad, but the possibility that the modern age had changed war forever, because war was no longer only about brave soldiers on open fields. It had become a contest of engines, fuel, iron, chemistry, code, transport, and production. And the side that could build faster, ship farther, and innovate harder would not just survive, it would rule. And that is when America made a choice that would reshape the world, a choice to become not merely a participant in war, but the workshop of destruction itself, the place where planes would be born in endless rows, where tanks would roll out like clockwork, where bullets, shells, trucks, radios, ships, engines, and explosives would pour from assembly lines with such speed that enemies would begin to realize they were not fighting only soldiers. They were fighting an entire industrial civilization. And once that machine started, it never truly stopped. Because when President Franklin Roosevelt described the United States as the arsenal of democracy, it sounded noble, almost defensive. But hidden inside that phrase was something much colder, a blueprint for how a democracy could become the greatest war manufacturer in human history. And what made it so dangerous was not only the size of the factories, but the marriage between government planning and private industry. Because once Washington learned how to direct the energy of corporations, engineers, financiers, railroads, steel plants, chemical labs, shipyards, and machine shops toward a single military goal, a new kind of power was born. And it was not temporary, it was addictive, because the war taught American leaders that when industry and strategy moved together, no rival could easily match them. And by the time the war reached its hottest years, the transformation was almost unbelievable, because war production had swollen to a staggering share of the national economy, with roughly 44% of the nation's total output tied to the war effort at its peak, meaning almost half the country was, in one way or another, breathing for battle, building for battle, shipping for battle, feeding battle, and preparing for battle. And that scale matters because it reveals something many people still underestimate. America did not simply win because it had courage. It won because it built a machine so vast that entire enemy strategies began collapsing under the weight of U.S. production. Because what happens when one country can replace ships faster than they can be sunk, replace aircraft faster than they can be shot down, replace vehicles faster than they can be destroyed, and train men to operate all of it while still expanding output. What happens is that war stops being a gamble and starts becoming arithmetic. And America was learning to make that arithmetic lethal. And inside that transformation stood one of the most important but least glamorous institutions in military history, the War Production Board. Because while the world remembers battlefield heroes and famous generals, it was often anonymous planners, industrial coordinators, procurement officers, logistics designers, and production managers who quietly built the skeleton of modern American military supremacy, and the War Production Board became the command table where civilian industry was reorganized into a weapon, where consumer factories were converted, where supply bottlenecks were hunted down, where priorities were assigned, where resources were redirected, and where private companies were told in clear terms that the age of peacetime business had ended and the age of total mobilization had begun. And this was the real beginning of the American arsenal, not just in steel and explosives, but in systems, because systems are what make arsenals powerful, not isolated inventions. Because a tank without fuel is scrap, a fighter without spare parts is dead metal, a ship without trained crews is only floating steel. And what America mastered in those years was not just production, but integration, the linking together of labor, science, finance, transportation, engineering, and command to a single chain of force. And once that chain was forged, it would become the hidden spine of American military power for generations. But even then, even in those years of massive output, there was a darker realization creeping through the minds of military planners, because they could already sense that factories alone would not be enough in the wars of the future, because war was changing again, becoming more scientific, more secretive, more technical, more apocalyptic, and somewhere deep inside the guarded facilities and hidden laboratories of wartime America, another force was being born, one that would push the U.S. arsenal beyond conventional power and into something far more frightening. Because while millions of workers assembled rifles, bombers, engines, and artillery in public view, a smaller and more secret army of physicists, chemists, engineers, and military officers were working on a weapon so destructive that even the men funding it could barely comprehend what they were unleashing. And that weapon was not simply another addition to the arsenal. It was the beginning of an entirely new era of power, because the Manhattan Project did more than build the atomic bomb. It proved something that would permanently change how the United States thought about war. It proved that if the federal government poured enough money, secrecy, urgency, and scientific talent into one problem, it could produce a weapon that changed the rules of the world overnight. And that lesson was almost more important than the bomb itself, because it taught Washington that scientific research was not a side project of national defense. It was now the heart of it. And from that moment onward, military power would not only be measured by troop numbers or battlefield courage, but by who could invent first, build first, deploy first, and hide their breakthroughs until it was too late for rivals to respond. And this is where the suspense in America's arsenal story truly begins, because after the bombs fell and the world stared in horror at what had been created, many people believed the nightmare had reached its end. They thought the war had exhausted the appetite for militarization. They assumed demobilization would naturally follow, that factories would cool, contracts would fade, and America would step back from the edge. But behind the speeches of peace and victory, another conversation was already underway. And that conversation was not about slowing down. It was about what must never happen again. What if another enemy rose? What if another industrial war exploded? What if the next war came faster than the last? What if the next enemy struck with rockets, or nuclear fire, or long-range bombers? What if the next war gave no time to prepare? And from those fears emerged a ruthless conclusion, America could never again afford to start from scratch. It would need to remain ready, not temporarily, not emotionally, but structurally, permanently, financially, politically, and psychologically ready. And this was the most important turning point of all, because once a country decides that military readiness must become permanent, the arsenal stops being an emergency tool and becomes a way of national life. And that is exactly what began to happen. Slowly at first, almost invisibly, as wartime relationships hardened into peacetime institutions, as contracts turned into networks, as laboratories became permanent, as military procurement stopped being an exception and became an engine, as regions of the country began tying their jobs and political futures to defense spending, and as the line between war preparation and normal governance began to blur, and the public did not fully see it happening because the language was always careful, always defensive, always framed around safety and deterrence and preparedness. But beneath those words was the birth of something massive, a new American reality in which military strength would no longer rise only in wartime and sleep in peace. It would remain awake, funded, refined, and sharpened every year, every decade, every administration. And once that logic took hold, there was no easy way back, because an arsenal this large develops its own momentum, its own political gravity, its own industrial dependencies, its own fears, and its own justifications. And in the years ahead, that momentum would only grow stronger, because the world was about to enter a colder, quieter, and in many ways more dangerous conflict than anything seen before. A conflict where bombs might not fall every day, but where the race for superiority would never stop, where scientists would become as important as soldiers, where contractors would become as influential as commanders, and where every new missile, every new bomber, every new submarine, every new radar system, every new code-breaking device, every new stealth breakthrough, and every new defense budget would become part of a silent contest for survival and dominance. But that future had not fully arrived yet. Not in this moment, because in the ashes of the Second World War, America was standing at the edge of a new identity. No longer simply a victorious nation, but a nation that had tasted what overwhelming industrialized force could achieve. And once a state tastes that kind of power, once it sees enemies collapse under the weight of its factories and science, once it discovers that steel, oil, code, and research can shape the map of the world, it does not easily forget. And that is why the modern American weapons arsenal was never just built in warehouses and shipyards. It was built in the mind first, in the conviction that the next war would come, that preparedness meant survival, and that dominance was safer than vulnerability. And by the end of the war, one terrifying truth had settled into the bones of the American state. If peace was to be preserved, then America would have to prepare for war on a scale the world had never seen. And from that belief, from that fear, from that ambition, the greatest weapons machine in modern history began to rise, quietly, relentlessly, and with consequences that would reach far beyond the battlefields of one generation, because the real story was only beginning, and in the next chapter, that arsenal would refuse to sleep. As the war ended, the factories remained, the budgets returned, the Soviet shadow emerged, and the United States stepped into the age of permanent military power. When the guns of the Second World War finally began to fall silent, millions of people across America believed the nation would return to something normal, something calmer, something human again. Because after years of sacrifice, blood, rationing, fear, and endless production, it seemed natural to think the giant war machine would power down. The factories would cool, the contracts would dry up, and the country would step away from the edge of permanent military tension. But what the public could not fully see was that inside Washington, inside military planning rooms, inside intelligence circles, and inside the boardrooms of major defense companies, a new fear had already taken hold. And this fear was colder than the one that had driven wartime mobilization. Because this time, the enemy was not a visible army storming beaches or marching across borders. It was a rising rival with its own industrial power, its own ideology, its own military ambition, and its own hunger for global influence. And that rival was the Soviet Union. And as the alliance of wartime necessity collapsed into suspicion, American leaders came to a brutal conclusion. If the United States shut down its war machine now, it might one day wake up too late. And that one belief changed everything, because unlike previous wars in American history, this one did not end with a clean return to peace. Instead, it transformed the entire structure of the American state. And what emerged was something no previous generation had fully experienced: a permanent defense economy, a nation that would no longer build military power only when war arrived, but would maintain, expand, and modernize that power every year, every budget cycle, every administration, every crisis, and every whispered threat. And this was the moment the arsenal stopped being temporary and became permanent. And one of the clearest signs of that transformation came in 1950, when a secret policy paper known as NSC 68 helped redefine the future of American military power, because this document did not treat military readiness as an emergency measure. It treated it as the foundation of national survival in a dangerous world. And its message was simple but explosive. The Soviet threat was too serious, too global, and too unpredictable for America to ever again let down its guard. And that meant military spending had to rise, weapons development had to accelerate, alliances had to strengthen, and industrial capacity had to remain alive even in peacetime. And once that logic entered the bloodstream of the American government, it became almost impossible to remove, because fear is one of the strongest fuels of state power, and the Cold War supplied a constant stream of fear: fear of nuclear attack, fear of communist expansion, fear of missile gaps, fear of technological surprise, fear of losing the skies, the seas, the oceans, and even outer space. And every one of those fears became a reason to spend more, build more, test more, and prepare more. And what made this new system especially powerful was that it was not built by government alone. It was built through a deep and growing partnership between the Pentagon, Congress, and private defense companies. A relationship so strong and so enduring that it would eventually shape entire regions of the country. Because as military budgets expanded, contracts began flowing not just into old industrial centers, but into new zones of aerospace, engineering, electronics, shipbuilding, and weapons design, especially across the South and West. In places like California and Texas, where entire local economies began to depend on defense spending. And over time, this network became known by many observers as the Gun Belt, a vast belt of political and industrial power tied directly to the business of military production. And this mattered far more than most people realize, because once jobs, housing, education, infrastructure, and regional prosperity become linked to weapons contracts, military spending stops being just a national security issue. It becomes a domestic economic engine, and that makes it harder to slow down, harder to question, and much easier to protect politically. Because now every new bomber program, every missile project, every shipbuilding contract, every radar facility, and every airbase expansion was not only about strategy, it was also about livelihoods, elections, influence, and local power. And this is where the suspense of the Arsenal story deepens. Because the machine was no longer just surviving, It was rooting itself into the American system so deeply that it could outlive presidents, survive wars, and adapt to every new threat. And at the center of this structure was what many later called the Iron Triangle, the powerful relationship between the Pentagon, defense contractor, and Congress, where each side reinforced the others because the military asked for capabilities, contractors designed and produced them, and lawmakers protected the funding that kept the cycle alive. And while this system often produced extraordinary weapons and technological breakthroughs, it also created something more unsettling, a self-sustaining momentum, a force that could keep expanding even when the public barely understood how large it had become. And that is how America entered a new age, not just as a strong country, but as a country whose military strength was now built into its institutions, its politics, its science, its business culture, and its future. And every Cold War crisis only made that machine stronger, because every Soviet bomb test, every confrontation in Europe, every revolution abroad, every war in Asia, every satellite launched into orbit, and every intelligence report warning of enemy advances became another justification for larger budgets, deeper research, and deadlier systems. And as the Cold War intensified, America's arsenal began to transform from a wartime stockpile into a permanent ecosystem of production, research, strategy, and power projection. One that could not only fight wars, but shape the world before wars even began. And this is what made it so formidable. Because the United States was no longer merely reacting to danger, it was building the capacity to dominate every future battlefield before it existed. And by the time the nation fully understood what had happened, the machine was already too vast to imagine without it. And in the next chapter, that machine would discover its greatest weapon of all, not manpower, not even money alone, but technology. Because America was about to learn that in the modern age, the side that invents faster can rule longer. And the race for military supremacy would move from factories and assembly lines into laboratories, test ranges, hidden airfields, and secret programs that would change war forever. By the time the Cold War had tightened its grip on the world, one truth had become painfully clear inside American military planning circles. The United States could not rely on manpower alone to guarantee victory, because while America was rich, industrially powerful, and globally ambitious, it also faced rivals who could field enormous armies, absorb terrible losses, and stretch conflict across continents. And that meant the United States needed something more than size. It needed an edge so sharp, so advanced, and so difficult to copy that even a numerically larger enemy would hesitate before challenging it. And that edge would become technology, not as a supporting tool, but as the beating heart of American military superiority. Because from the early years of the Cold War onward, Washington began investing in scientific research with a seriousness and scale that transformed the very meaning of war. And this was not random experimentation. This was a deliberate strategy to make the American arsenal smarter, faster, stealthier, farther-reaching, and more precise than anything its rivals could field. And that strategy would prove so powerful that it changed not only military history, but civilian life across the entire world. Because some of the most important technologies that define modern civilization were born from military fear, military funding, and military ambition. And what made this transformation so dangerous was that it happened quietly, often far from public view, in laboratories, air bases, desert test sites, intelligence compounds, naval research centers, and sealed contractor facilities where engineers and scientists were given one mission: build what the enemy cannot match. And from that mission came an avalanche of innovation, because the United States understood something many empires had learned too late. If you cannot always outnumber your rival, then you must outthink, outrange, outsee and outstrike him. And that is why the arsenal America was building was not just large, it was increasingly intelligent. Because intelligence in weapons is what turns force into dominance. And one of the most powerful examples of this was stealth technology, a concept that sounded almost like science fiction when it first began to emerge, because the idea of designing aircraft that could slip through enemy radar and strike before being seen felt almost unreal. But that is exactly the kind of advantage American planners wanted. And through years of classified research, mathematical modeling, materials engineering, and flight testing, the United States turned that dream into a battlefield revolution, proving that the future of war would not belong only to whoever had the biggest fleet or the most troops, but to whoever could remain invisible long enough to decide the fight before it even properly began. And stealth was only one piece of a much larger puzzle, because at the same time, the United States was investing heavily in radar electronic warfare, advanced sensors, surveillance systems, and command networks that could detect, track, and coordinate military force across vast distances. And this matters because modern war is not only about weapons, it is about information. And the side that sees first often shoots first, and the side that shoots first often wins. And so America built an arsenal that was not merely destructive, but aware, an arsenal that could watch, calculate, guide, communicate, and adapt, and perhaps no innovation symbolized that transformation more than the rise of satellite-based navigation and positioning systems, what the world would later know as GPS, because what began as a military tool to help forces navigate and strike with greater accuracy became one of the most important systems ever created, changing civilian travel, commerce, communications, and everyday life. But its origins were rooted in a brutal military question. How do you ensure your forces can move, target, and coordinate anywhere on Earth with deadly reliability? And the answer was to build an invisible grid in the sky. And that answer changed everything. Because once military forces can know where they are, where the enemy is, and where their weapons will land with extraordinary precision, the old chaos of war begins to narrow, and American power becomes more efficient, more flexible, and far more dangerous. And this is where the suspense in the story deepens, because the same research that gave the United States unmatched military reach also spilled into the civilian world, creating a strange and powerful cycle, where defense innovation strengthened private industry, and private industry, in turn, strengthened defense innovation. And this dual-use relationship became one of the hidden engines of the arsenal, because technologies developed for war often found second lives in civilian markets, and technologies refined in civilian markets often found their way back into war. And nowhere is this more striking than in the story of the Internet, because what much of the world now sees as a civilian communication revolution has roots in Cold War defense thinking, in efforts to build resilient communication systems that could survive disruption and maintain command links under extreme conditions. And over time, these military-driven breakthroughs helped create an innovation ecosystem that kept American contractors, engineers, universities, and laboratories at the very frontier of manufacturing and applied science, which meant the arsenal was not just being maintained, it was constantly being upgraded by the same society that was also producing civilian progress. And that gave the United States a tremendous long-term advantage, because it meant military innovation was not isolated from the broader economy. It was embedded within it. And while all of this was transforming conventional military power, another and even more terrifying race was unfolding in parallel. The race for nuclear dominance, because after the atomic bomb had first shattered the old rules of war, The United States realized that controlling the nuclear frontier would become central to its security and its global power. And in the years that followed, the arsenal expanded, not only in size but in destructive possibility, as warheads, delivery systems, strategic bombers, and missile programs multiplied. And what began as a wartime breakthrough became a permanent contest of deterrence, fear, and technical superiority. Because nuclear weapons are unlike any other tools of war. They do not simply threaten armies, they threaten civilizations. And that is why America's nuclear buildup was never only about destruction. It was about signaling, about psychology, about making potential enemies believe that the cost of direct confrontation would be unbearable. And that is one of the deepest secrets behind the arsenal. It was designed not only to fight wars, but to prevent certain wars by making American retaliation seem overwhelming, immediate, and inescapable. And yet the irony was chilling, because the more advanced the arsenal became, the more dangerous the stakes of miscalculation also became. And the world entered a strange era where peace was often preserved by the terrifying perfection of weapons no one wanted to use. And that contradiction sat at the center of American military strategy for decades, because technological supremacy brought security. But it also brought permanent tension, permanent competition, and permanent pressure to stay ahead. Because in a world where your rivals are also innovating, there is no finish line, and that is why the arsenal never stopped evolving. Why new bombers replaced old ones. Why missiles grew faster. Why submarines became quieter. Why sensors became sharper. And why research budgets kept expanding. Because the most dangerous moment in military competition is not when you are behind, it is when you think you can afford to stop moving. And the United States refused to stop moving. And in the next chapter, that relentless drive would be fueled by something as powerful as science and almost as powerful as fear, money, on a scale so vast that it would leave every rival struggling to keep up, because once America combined industrial depth, permanent institutions, technological innovation, and historic levels of financial investment, the arsenal was no longer just the strongest on Earth. It was becoming something no empire before it had ever fully achieved. A military machine with the resources to dominate across land, sea, air, cyberspace, and beyond. If fear built the foundation of America's modern arsenal, and technology sharpened its teeth, then money gave it the power to keep growing long after other nations would have slowed down. Because no matter how brilliant a scientist may be, no matter how ambitious a military planner may sound, and no matter how advanced a weapon may appear on paper, none of it becomes real without money. And the United States possessed something almost no rival could consistently match: the ability to pour staggering financial resources into military power year after year, decade after decade, without allowing the machine to collapse under its own weight. And that is one of the biggest reasons America built the most powerful weapons arsenal in history. Because while other nations often surged during war and shrank during peace, the United States learned how to keep funding military superiority as a permanent national habit. And over time, that habit became so enormous that much of the world stopped seeing it for what it truly was, because when something remains huge for too long, people begin to think it is normal. But there is nothing normal about the scale of American military spending, and there has not been for a very long time, because while many countries struggle to maintain a few key capabilities, the United States has spent enough not only to sustain a global military posture, but to modernize it continuously, test it constantly, and prepare it for wars that have not even happened yet. And that is where the suspense in this story becomes even more intense. Because the American arsenal was not simply built for yesterday's enemies. It was financed to survive tomorrow's surprises, and that requires a different level of commitment, one measured not in slogans but in hundreds of billions, and eventually in sums so large they become difficult for ordinary people to imagine, because behind every stealth aircraft, every missile defense system, every aircraft carrier, every submarine, every satellite network, every intelligence platform, every cyber command center, every drone fleet, and every advanced munitions stockpile lies a river of funding so vast that it has allowed the United States to keep fighting, researching, replacing, upgrading, and preparing on a scale unmatched in modern history. And what made this especially powerful was not just the amount of money, but the consistency of it. Because consistency is what turns spending into dominance, and dominance into structure, and structure into habit. And once military spending becomes a habit woven into the nation's political and industrial bloodstream, it becomes incredibly difficult to reverse, because now entire chains of workers, engineers, bases, suppliers, testing ranges, universities, shipyards, software firms, and strategic commands depend on that financial flow to remain alive. And that means the arsenal is not funded like a temporary emergency. It is funded like a living ecosystem, one that must constantly feed or risk decay. And American leaders understood that decay in military power can be deadly, because in the modern age, a weapon system that is not updated can become obsolete faster than most people realize, and so money became not only a means of acquisition, but a shield against strategic surprise, a way to ensure that if a rival developed something new, the United States would already have several answers in motion. And by the time the 2020s arrived, that financial commitment had become so immense that the United States was spending more on defense than the next several major military powers combined in many years. And that matters because it reveals the true scale of the arsenal. This was not just a large military by national standards. It was a military backed by a budgetary universe of its own, one large enough to support not only conventional warfighting, but nuclear deterrence, naval dominance, global logistics, intelligence collection, aerospace superiority, cyber operations, and next-generation experimentation all at the same time. And that kind of breadth is rare in history because most powers are forced to choose. But America often financed the ability to pursue everything at once. And that created a military posture with very few true equals. And yet what makes this chapter even more important is that the money was not only spent on what people could already see, it was increasingly directed toward what people could not yet fully understand, because as the world moved deeper into the 21st century, American military planners began focusing not just on ships and planes and bombs, but on the future architecture of war itself. And that future looked very different from the industrial battlefields of the past, because now the battlefield could be digital, autonomous, invisible, and instantaneous. And so the money followed the threat, pouring into artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, hypersonic missiles, uncrewed autonomous systems, data fusion, advanced sensors, electronic warfare, and command networks designed to think and react faster than any human opponent could comfortably handle. And this is where the story becomes especially chilling, because the arsenal was no longer simply a collection of weapons. It was becoming an adaptive organism, one designed to sense, process, decide, and strike across multiple domains with frightening speed. And every major investment was part of that transformation, because artificial intelligence promised to change how threats are detected, how targets are prioritized, how logistics are managed, and how military decision-making is accelerated. while cyber warfare opened an entirely new front, where states could disrupt infrastructure, blind defenses, corrupt systems, and strike without firing a single visible shot, and hypersonic missiles introduced another terrifying layer, weapons so fast and maneuverable that traditional defenses could be strained or bypassed, forcing America not only to build them, but to build the systems that could detect and defeat them. And alongside all of this came autonomous drones and uncrewed systems, not merely as support tools, but as force multipliers, able to scout, swarm, strike, and persist in dangerous environments where human exposure would be costly. And every one of these priorities required not just imagination, but relentless financial commitment, because advanced warfare is expensive long before the first prototype ever flies, and that is the secret many people miss. The real power of the American arsenal lies not only in what is already fielded, but in the nation's capacity to keep financing what comes next. And that is what separates a great military from a truly dominant one, because dominance is not only about what you own today, it is about how quickly and how deeply you can prepare for the future. And this is why money became one of the most silent but decisive weapons in America's rise, because while enemies studied tanks, bombers, carriers, and missiles, the deeper advantage often sat inside the budget itself, inside the ability to absorb cost, sustain long-term programs, fund expensive failures, and still keep pushing forward until success was achieved. And that resilience is terrifying in its own way, because it means setbacks rarely kill the machine, they only redirect it. And by now, the arsenal had become something larger than a wartime necessity, larger than a Cold War response, larger even than a set of industries. It had become a national engine of strategic continuity. And in the next chapter, all of that money, all of that science, and all of that industrial depth would come together in the actual architecture of power itself. The weapon systems that turned America's arsenal into a force able to dominate from the ocean depths to the edge of space. Because the true genius of the arsenal was not only that it was large, but that it was designed to overwhelm in every direction at once. By the time America had built the factories, secured the money, tied together the politicians and contractors, and unlocked the terrifying power of military science, one final question remained. What kind of arsenal should a global superpower actually build if it wants not just to survive war, but to dominate every possible battlefield before the enemy even understands what is happening? And the answer the United States developed was as ambitious as it was intimidating. It would not rely on a single miracle weapon, a single branch of service, or a single style of war. Instead, it would build a layered system of overwhelming force across land, sea, air, space, cyberspace, and the nuclear shadow that hangs over all of them. And this is the real secret of America's arsenal, not merely that it owns powerful weapons, but that those weapons were designed to work together like the moving parts of a giant mechanical predator, watching, positioning, striking, and surviving across multiple domains at once. And at the very center of that architecture stands the most feared insurance policy in modern military history, the nuclear triad, because if the United States wanted to guarantee that no enemy could destroy its ability to retaliate in one devastating first blow, then it needed three separate and mutually reinforcing ways to deliver nuclear force. And so America built a triad of strategic bombers, land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, and ballistic missile submarines, each one covering the weaknesses of the others, and together creating a force so resilient that even in the nightmare scenario of surprise attack, enough of the arsenal would survive to unleash catastrophic retaliation. And that terrifying certainty is precisely the point, because the triad was never just built to destroy. It was built to make enemies think twice before they ever dared to challenge America directly. And to this day, the U.S. Department of Defense still describes the triad as a resilient and flexible force designed to deter catastrophic aggression and guarantee a decisive response if deterrence fails. U.S. Department of War +1. The first leg of that triad rises from the air, and it carries with it the cold logic of strategic reach, because bombers are not just weapons, they are messages, visible symbols of power that can be launched, redirected, recalled, or used to signal intent without immediately crossing the point of no return. And for decades, bombers like the B-52 helped define American strategic presence. But the future of this airborne deterrent is now increasingly tied to the B-21 Raider, a stealth bomber designed to penetrate heavily defended airspace and deliver both conventional and nuclear munitions. And what makes the B-21 especially important is not just its destructive potential, but the philosophy behind it, because it was built for tomorrow's high-threat environment, a world where enemies are expected to possess better radar, better missile defenses, better sensors, and more layered anti-access systems than ever before. And yet America's answer was not to retreat, but to create an aircraft designed to move through that danger and strike anyway. And according to the U.S. Air Force, the B-21 is expected to become the backbone of the future bomber force and is being built as part of a broader family of systems for long-range strike, intelligence, surveillance, communications, and electronic attack, proving once again that America's most powerful weapons are rarely standalone objects. They are integrated systems built to dominate complex battle networks. U.S. Air Force +1. The second leg of the triad sits in the ground, silent, buried, and always waiting, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Force, because if bombers represent flexibility, land-based missiles represent speed and immediate credibility. And while they are often less glamorous in the public imagination than stealth aircraft or giant warships, their strategic value lies in the fact that they force any potential enemy to account for hundreds of hardened targets spread across American territory, making any first strike calculation infinitely more dangerous and uncertain. And uncertainty in nuclear strategy can be the difference between deterrence and disaster, because if an enemy believes it can eliminate your retaliatory capacity in one blow, the temptation to strike first grows. But if your force is dispersed, protected, and always ready, then the risk becomes unbearable. And that is why the land-based missile force remains a core part of the arsenal, not because it is beautiful, but because it complicates enemy planning and reinforces the terrifying logic of survivable retaliation. And then comes the third leg, perhaps the most chilling of all, the ballistic missile submarine fleet, known in military language as the sea-based deterrent, and in popular imagination as the hidden doomsday reserve, because unlike fixed missile silos or visible bomber bases, these submarines vanish into the ocean, and once they disappear beneath the waves, they become one of the hardest military assets on Earth to find and destroy, which is exactly why they are so valuable, because a hidden retaliatory force is one of the strongest pillars of deterrence ever created. And this is why the submarine arm of the arsenal matters so much, because it ensures that even if unimaginable destruction reached American soil, the capacity to respond would still survive in silence somewhere far beyond the horizon. And that possibility alone changes the strategic calculations of every rival power on Earth. And when people speak casually about the strength of the U.S. arsenal, this is often the layer they underestimate, because hidden force is often more powerful than visible force, and America mastered both. But nuclear deterrence alone does not explain how the United States built the most powerful weapons arsenal in history, because most of the wars America actually fights or prepares for are not all-out nuclear exchanges. They are conventional conflicts, crises, interventions, standoffs, and contests of influence that require precision, flexibility, mobility, and endurance. And this is where the conventional side of the arsenal becomes just as impressive. Because America did not simply build a big military, it built one capable of projecting force almost anywhere on Earth, often with shocking speed, and nowhere is that more visible than in the aircraft carrier strike group, perhaps the most recognizable symbol of U.S. military reach, because an American carrier is not just a ship, it is a floating air base, a mobile fortress, a command hub, and a political signal all at once. And when backed by cruisers, destroyers, submarines, logistics ships, aircraft, and intelligence support, a carrier strike group becomes an instrument of power that can influence events thousands of miles from home without needing to seize territory first. And that is one of the greatest strengths of the arsenal. It can arrive before a war fully starts, shape the psychology of the conflict, reassure allies, intimidate rivals, and hold targets at risk long before boots hit the ground. And that kind of reach is something only a handful of nations have ever even dreamed of. But the United States built it into routine practice. Above those carriers and across forward air bases around the world, another key layer of the arsenal waits in the skies, advanced fighter aircraft, and few platforms better symbolize that modern edge than the F-35, because while many people see it simply as a jet, its real significance lies in what it represents, a fusion of stealth, sensors, networking, electronic warfare, and strike capability all wrapped into a system built not just to shoot, but to see, share, and orchestrate the battlefield. And this is what makes modern American air power so dangerous, because the most important aircraft are no longer merely fast or heavily armed. They are information nodes capable of collecting data, analyzing threats, and passing targeting and situational awareness across a wider combat network. And according to Lockheed Martin, the F-35 was designed to collect, analyze, and share information across air, land, and sea environments, making it less of a lone fighter and more of a battlefield quarterback. And that concept matters enormously because it means the arsenal is becoming more connected, more synchronized, and more capable of turning separate weapons into one coordinated strike architecture. Lockheed Martin +1. And then there are the missile systems that hold the line when threats are inbound, because offense without defense leaves even a powerful military exposed. And America's arsenal was built not only to hit hard, but to survive incoming attack. And that is why systems like Patriot became so important, because they embody the defensive side of strategic dominance, the ability to track, intercept, and defeat hostile aircraft and missiles before they can inflict damage. And while these systems are often discussed in technical terms, their strategic value is deeply human, because they protect bases, cities, troops, and allied infrastructure. And in doing so, they preserve the freedom of action that offensive power depends on, because a force that cannot defend itself becomes cautious, but a force that can shield key assets can move with confidence, and that confidence is part of what has made the American arsenal so effective in crisis after crisis. Yet perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of all this power is not the hardware itself, but the industrial partnerships that keep it alive, because no arsenal this large can exist if the state is unable to replenish, modernize, repair, and scale production over time. And this is where the Department of Defense acts not only as a military institution, but as a gigantic and highly influential client, sustaining the companies, shipyards, electronics firms, software developers, aerospace giants, and specialized suppliers that turn strategy into metal, code, fuel, propulsion, armor, and firepower. And this relationship is not accidental, it is foundational, because America learned long ago that battlefield dominance begins long before the first shot. It begins in contracts, engineering schedules, testing pipelines, manufacturing tolerances, supply chains, and the ability to produce high-quality weapons not once, but repeatedly and at scale. And that is what makes the arsenal more than a museum of impressive machines. It is a living production system, one capable of adapting and regenerating under pressure. And even today, the wider arms production ecosystem continues to expand, with SIPRI reporting that the world's largest arms-producing companies reached record revenues in 2024, including major U.S. firms deeply tied to the American defense system. SIPRI +1. And this is where the full suspense of the story comes into focus, because when you step back and look at the whole design, the genius of the arsenal is not any one bomber, one submarine, one jet, one missile battery, or one ship. It is the way all of them fit into a strategy of layered dominance, a strategy built on deterrence at the nuclear level, reach at the naval level, precision at the air level, protection at the missile defense level, and industrial endurance underneath it all. And that is why the arsenal has remained so difficult to challenge, because defeating one piece does not collapse the system. The system was built with redundancy, resilience, and depth, and in war, depth is often what decides survival, because when the first line is hit, the second line must still function, and when the second line is strained, the hidden line must still remain lethal, and America built all of those lines. But even the most powerful arsenal in history has a shadow, because the larger it grows, the more questions it raises about cost, about ethics, about overreach, about whether military supremacy guarantees safety or simply ensures endless competition. And that is the darker tension running beneath the entire story, because every weapon built to preserve peace can also intensify fear. Every technological leap can trigger a rival response, and every display of overwhelming force can inspire both deterrence and resistance. And that is why the story of America's arsenal is not just about machines, it is about power itself, how nations build it, how they justify it, and how they live with the consequences of possessing it. And in the final chapter, all of these threads will come together, because we are now at the point where the arsenal is no longer just the product of history. It is the shape of the future. And the final question is the most unsettling one of all. What happens when the most powerful weapons machine ever built begins preparing not for the last war, but for the next war the world cannot yet fully see? By the time the United States had built the factories, locked in the budgets, mastered the science, and assembled the terrifying architecture of power that stretched from underground missile silos to stealth bombers and silent submarines beneath the sea, one reality had become impossible to ignore. The age of traditional military supremacy was no longer enough, because the next war, if it comes, may not begin with marching armies, dramatic speeches, or even visible explosions. It may begin in code, in orbit, in data, in deception, in machine speed, and in 1,000 hidden actions taking place before the public even realizes a conflict has started. And that is why the most powerful weapons arsenal in history is no longer being shaped only for the wars America once fought, but for the wars it fears are still ahead, wars that may unfold faster, wider, and more unpredictably than anything the modern world has yet experienced. And this is where the story becomes most chilling, because for all the tanks, carriers, bombers, and missiles the world can see, the most important race inside the American arsenal today is over who will control the future battlefield before the first shot is ever fired. And American planners know that if they wait until war begins to prepare for that future, they will already be too late. Because the next major conflict may not give time for adjustment. And so the United States is now building not only stronger weapons, but smarter systems, faster decisions, deeper resilience, and a military structure designed to survive chaos in every domain at once. And at the center of that transformation is one idea that has quietly become one of the most powerful forces in modern warfare: speed. Not just the speed of missiles or aircraft, but the speed of detection, analysis, targeting, communication, and response. Because in future war, the side that understands what is happening first and reacts first may not simply gain an advantage. It may decide the outcome before the enemy has time to recover. And that is why artificial intelligence has become one of the most heavily watched frontiers of American defense planning. Because AI is not just about robots or science fiction fantasies. It is about compressing decision time, processing vast amounts of battlefield information, identifying patterns, spotting threats, optimizing logistics, improving targeting, and helping commanders move faster than any human-only system can comfortably handle. And this matters because future war may unfold at such high speed that hesitation itself becomes lethal. And if one military can sense, decide, and act even a little faster across thousands of interactions, that edge can become overwhelming. And America understands that better than most, which is why AI is increasingly being woven into everything from intelligence analysis to drone operations to battlefield command systems. Because the arsenal of the future is not just metal and explosives. It is software, networks, data, and machine-assisted judgment. But speed alone is not enough if your systems can be blinded, disrupted, or corrupted. And that is where another battlefield emerges, one far less visible, but potentially just as devastating as bombs or missiles: cyberspace. Because in the modern age, a rival may not need to destroy your runway if it can cripple the systems that manage your aircraft. It may not need to sink your ship if it can disrupt navigation, jam communications, or poison the information your commanders rely on. And this is why cyber warfare has become one of the most dangerous and least understood pillars of the American arsenal. Because cyber conflict does not always arrive with spectacle. Often it arrives silently, through access, intrusion, sabotage, surveillance, and digital manipulation. And its effects can spread across military command structures, power grids, logistics chains, financial systems, satellite links, and industrial networks, meaning the line between civilian life and military vulnerability becomes thinner than ever before. And that is exactly why the United States has poured enormous energy into cyber defense and offensive cyber capability. Because if future war includes attempts to blind, confuse, or paralyze critical systems, then military superiority will depend not only on what weapons you own, but on whether your networks can survive attack while your enemy's networks cannot. And that introduces a deeply unsettling truth. Some of the most important battles of the future may happen without television cameras, without dramatic footage, and without the public fully understanding that a war is already underway. And then there is space, the high ground of the 21st century, because once military forces rely on satellites for communication, targeting, navigation, surveillance, missile warning, weather tracking, and command coordination, orbit itself becomes part of the battlefield. And the United States has long understood that whoever protects and controls those invisible eyes and links in the sky holds a massive advantage on Earth below. Because without space-based support, even the most advanced military can become slower, less accurate, less connected, and more vulnerable. And this is why America's future arsenal includes not only aircraft, ships, and missiles, but also the systems needed to defend, replace, harden, and exploit the space infrastructure that modern warfare now depends on. Because if future conflict spreads into orbit, then resilience there becomes just as important as armor on land or carriers at sea. And that is one reason the U.S. military increasingly speaks of multi-domain operations, a phrase that sounds technical but carries a profound meaning. The future fight will not happen in one place at one time. It will happen across land, sea, air, space, cyberspace, and the electromagnetic spectrum simultaneously. And the military that can coordinate all of those layers into one coherent action will possess a terrifying edge. This is also why uncrewed and autonomous systems are becoming such an important part of the arsenal, because future battlefields may be too contested, too fast, and too dangerous to rely only on human-operated platforms. And so the United States is increasingly investing in drones, robotic systems, autonomous surveillance tools, loitering munitions, and collaborative aircraft designed to operate alongside human pilots and commanders. And this does not mean human beings disappear from war, far from it. But it does mean the shape of force is changing, because machines can persist longer, scout farther, absorb more risk, and in some scenarios overwhelm defenses through numbers and coordination. And if America can combine manned and unmanned systems into one integrated force, then it expands not only its reach, but its survivability, because now the arsenal can probe, strike, distract, and gather intelligence without exposing every valuable human asset at the front edge of danger. And that flexibility may prove decisive in future conflicts where the first hours could determine everything. Yet for all this futuristic power, one of the most surprising truths about the American arsenal is that its greatest strength may still be something older and less glamorous: adaptability. Because the world changes, enemies evolve, technologies spread, and no military can perfectly predict the next war. But the United States has repeatedly tried to build an arsenal capable not only of hitting hard, but of changing shape under pressure. And that may be the deepest reason it has remained so dominant for so long, because dominance is not simply the possession of superior weapons. It is the ability to absorb shocks, replace losses, update doctrine, fund new experiments, and keep moving while rivals are still trying to understand what just happened. And that quality, that restless refusal to stand still, has defined America's military machine from the arsenal of democracy to the nuclear age, to the era of cyber conflict and autonomous systems. But there is a final tension running beneath all of this, one that makes the story as unsettling as it is impressive. Because the more powerful the arsenal becomes, the more it reshapes the world around it. And power on this scale does not exist in isolation. It influences alliances, provokes competitors, fuels arms races, alters diplomacy, and changes how other nations think about survival, resistance, and deterrence. And that means the American arsenal is not just a shield, not just a sword, and not just a machine. It is also a force that shapes the psychology of the entire international system. Because when one country possesses unmatched military reach, every rival must respond somehow, and every ally must decide how closely to depend on it. And every crisis becomes more dangerous because the tools available are more advanced, more immediate, and more consequential than ever before. And that is why the story of how America built the most powerful weapons arsenal in history is not merely a story about strength. It is a story about what happens when a nation decides that it must never again be caught unprepared, and then spends generations turning that fear into an industrial, technological, and strategic reality so vast that it begins to define the age itself. And in the final chapter, we will bring it all together, because once you understand how this arsenal was built, the final question becomes impossible to avoid. Has America created the ultimate guarantee of security, or has it built a machine so powerful that the entire world now lives in its shadow? By now, the pattern is impossible to miss. America did not build the most powerful weapons arsenal in history through one miracle moment, one president, one war, or one invention. It built it layer by layer, fear by fear, budget by budget, contract by contract, and breakthrough by breakthrough, beginning in the furnace of the Second World War, when the United States discovered that industrial mobilization could decide the fate of empires, hardening during the Cold War, when Washington concluded that military readiness could never again be allowed to sleep, accelerating through scientific innovation that turned research labs into battlefields of the future, expanding through financial investment so immense that few rivals could even imagine matching it, and maturing into a global architecture of force where nuclear deterrence, naval reach, air dominance, missile defense, cyber capability, space infrastructure, and autonomous systems now operate as parts of one vast and deeply interconnected machine. And when you step back from the individual bombers, missiles, ships, satellites, and factories, what you are really looking at is not just an arsenal, but a philosophy, a national belief that power must be prepared in advance, that vulnerability invites danger, and that the price of hesitation in a violent world may be national disaster. And whether one sees that belief as wise, terrifying, necessary, or excessive, there is no denying its results, because no other country in modern history has assembled a military ecosystem quite like this one. An ecosystem with the industrial memory of the arsenal of democracy, the institutional permanence of the Cold War state, the technological ambition of a superpower that refuses to stand still, and the financial capacity to fund warfighting in every domain while still preparing for domains that are only just emerging. And that is why America's weapons arsenal has remained so difficult to challenge, because it is not merely a stockpile of destruction. It is a living system of production, adaptation, deterrence, and projection, built not only to fight wars, but to shape the conditions under which wars begin, escalate, or never happen at all. And yet the final truth of this story is the one that makes it most unsettling, because the stronger the arsenal became, the larger its shadow grew. And shadows of this kind do not stop at national borders. They stretch across diplomacy, alliances, rival military planning, global trade, intelligence operations, and the political imagination of the modern world itself. Because when one state can project force across oceans, sustain military presence across continents, and innovate at a pace that constantly threatens to widen the gap between itself and its competitors, every other major power is forced to react, and that reaction can take many forms: fear, imitation, deterrence, resistance, escalation, and arms racing. And this is where the paradox of American military supremacy becomes impossible to ignore, because the arsenal was built in the name of security, but its very existence can also intensify insecurity in others. And that means it has helped preserve peace in some moments while making rivalry more intense in others. And this contradiction sits at the heart of modern power, because weapons do not merely defend nations. They also shape how nations think, how they fear, and how they prepare for one another. And so the story of America's arsenal is also the story of a world that has spent generations adjusting itself to the presence of a military machine so large, so advanced, and so globally embedded that even its silence can influence events far away. That is why this story matters, because it is not just about the past. It is about the future. And the future remains uncertain, because the next decisive struggle may not look like Normandy, Midway, Vietnam, Desert Storm, or even the post-9/11 wars. It may come through cyber sabotage, orbital disruption, Autonomous swarms, hypersonic strikes, artificial intelligence, accelerated decision-making, and economic warfare fused with military coercion. And in that world, the United States is once again doing what it has done since the mid-20th century, preparing early, funding heavily, experimenting constantly, and trying to ensure that if the next era of conflict arrives, it will arrive on terms America is ready to meet. And that is perhaps the clearest answer to the question we began with. How did America build the most powerful weapons arsenal in history? It built it by refusing to believe that peace would last forever, by turning fear into industry, industry into science, science into doctrine, doctrine into weapons, and weapons into a global system of power whose consequences are still unfolding right now, and whether history will judge that system as the ultimate shield of stability or as the most dangerous concentration of force ever assembled remains one of the defining questions of our time. Because one thing is certain, the arsenal is still growing, the machine is still learning, and the shadow it casts over the world has not faded. This is America Global Force, where we uncover the hidden history, strategy, and power behind the American military machine. Before you go, tell us where you are watching from, your city and country. And if you have not yet subscribed and liked this channel, please